Any question?
Hi, I have a few questions. Perhaps they're more perhaps additional comments to be made to the three very interesting presentations that help link them together. So Penny's closing remarks, and she made this call, this plea for granularity. And I think that's something that we certainly subscribe to. And if you think around, for example, the genesis or the motivation for extended supply use tables, it was largely driven by this need for additional granularity, because we recognize that when we talk about core statistics now that TIVA have become, the level of granularity isn't really sufficient to be able to answer all of these questions beyond the macro view. But we wanted to make sure as well that the conversation around granularity was done in an optimal way. When we talked about national statistics, we weren't going to just say, break it down by 20,000 different firm categories. We knew that would hit a confidential brick wall. So the idea of granularity was to try to do it in a clever way that allowed us to target GVCs. And so the modes that you've seen presented by both Dylan and Francisco around size, around export intensity, around basically ownership, are pushing in that direction, so to give you the right type of granularity. So for example, if you had a breakdown that spoke about exporters and non-exporters, automatically you're talking about a subset of firms that are much closer to what you need for GVC analysis. So that was really the motivation. I mean, the motivation, first and foremost, granularity, but also because by having that granularity done in that type of structured, sensible way, you end up addressing some of the other shortcomings with our current TIVA data. One thing that's often forgotten about TIVA is because we have an average of all firms within a given sector with very different import intensities and very different value added to output ratios, we generally underestimate the actual level of GVC integration. The import content of exports is a lower bound, really, within our current data set. This is why granularity really matters, and the right type of granularity. But the other important aspect of pushing the needle to have more different types of firms is that we have now new views that allow us to talk about integration in a slightly different way. We can now talk about, for example, the integration of SMEs in global value chains, the indirect integration that they have as basically domestic suppliers to larger firms that export. And so there's a different policy dimension that drives SME behavior, and there are also barriers to SMEs in terms of engaging in direct trade. But now we can have a story that talks about policies for SMEs can also improve the export orientation or the export performance of basically larger firms. And we can see that now. But the idea that we have this ownership dimension is twofold. I mean, the first, of course, is to improve basically the quality of the data, the quality of the results. The second is to provide a new type of view about the integration of foreign-owned firms in the production process. So for example, very simple questions like how much upstream jobs does this foreign investment create in my country can now be answered through this type of approach. But the last point, really, in terms of the focus on MNEs, which is really of relevance to the discussion we're having today in terms of digitalization, is the fact that MNEs can relocate or locate the underlying IP wherever they want, okay? And that IP can be basically located in a country that then all of a sudden gives us, in our current estimates of GVCs, high domestic value-added content from the country where the IP is located, okay? And that is not a distortion of reality, it's one view of reality. But it doesn't provide the full story, because that profit that's being generated by the affiliate in the country is typically repatriated back to the parent where the IP used to be located. So we see this distortion in the GVC, but the reality is to some extent somewhat different. The ability to view the ownership dimension in GVC analysis provides that granularity. And I'll just leave you with one really important statistic, I guess, that illustrates why this is crucial. So when we started looking, for example, let's say Mexico in the US, and we looked at, for example, the US content of Mexico's exports to the US, and for obvious reasons, that has an awful lot of policy relevance. It was about 20%, less than 20% in TIVA. But if you look at just the global manufacturers that Francisco mentioned, 1/3 of the total value of those exports back to the US reflects US foreign content, 1/3. half of it reflects Mexican content. If you then go the extra mile and you talk about the ownership dimension, and you say that there are US multinationals who are operating in Mexico, exporting back, the value added of those US multinationals is recorded as Mexican GDP. But we also know that those same value added flows that are being generated in Mexico by US manufacturers are repatriated back to the US as primary income. That primary income may reflect a payment for, implicitly a payment for intellectual property. So let's say for sake of argument that it was treated differently in the accounts and that primary income flow was a trade and service flow. Once you make that adjustment, the US benefits as much from those exports back to the US as do Mexico. They're both about 40% each. And that presents a very different picture in terms of the impact or the potential impact of tariffs imposed on Mexican exports to the US, because ultimately that tariff is going to affect Mexican companies, but it will affect US companies upstream in the value chain just as much. Just to illustrate the importance of the relevance of doing this type of work.
Thank you. Any more?
I was going to ask the panel, because there is research from Nick Bloom and also from Mellitz showing that a big part of the productivity difference between foreign-owned and domestic-owned companies is due to management differences. And I was going to ask if these extended supply and use tables would have any impact on our understanding on how these management and productivity differences happen.
Something else? Okay, we are going to use the reverse order. Penny.
Right. It's...
One more? Excuse me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, slight question. So I fully support what was said. It's very important to have the distinctive view of what is foreign-owned and not foreign-owned. But we have a big issue in the real side of the treatment of FDI. So what we see at the BIS is that there is an explosion of financing that is going through offshore centers. So basically, a group is financed through issuing debt in an offshore center, and then the fund is brought back to the company. And this in the national account is treated as FDI for non-financial corporate. For financial corporates, it's not like this. And apparently there is a huge distortion in this amount. So the issue is, yes, it's very important to look at what is foreign-owned and not, but sometimes we may think we are looking at foreign FDI, but it's not really FDI, it's something else.
No.
Right. I think it's been great to be able to see the addition of the firm origin. I think in the debt, I think that has been that's the direction that we need to be working in. The coverage of TIVA, we know that TIVA 2018 is much more extensive too as well across the industries, the number of industries. So that's definitely something that we are looking forward to being able to work with and see how the disaggregation matches the policy needs.
Dylan, you have
Sure.
any comment?
I'll just sort of give a shout out or support what was said by Nadim and our colleague from the Bank of International Settlements in terms of, there is work ongoing, and one of the objectives of the SNA research agenda is to take a closer look at inter-firm flows as well, and we'll have opportunities to revisit how some of those are recorded and treated in national accounts. So getting to the bottom of this explosion in offshore financing, for example, and these flows that are taking place within multinational firms is important. Same thing with intellectual property as well, that it can basically be moved through legal means and no real operations, movement of actual operations at all. So thank you for that.
Francisco, you are going to say the last words of the day.
Goodbye. No.
No, you have to answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's too late, but anyway, according with the different comments, of course, well, I look so many challenges here, especially when we are talking about global value changes, what that means on the special purpose entities, multinational enterprises, the granularity. Well, there is some conventions, of course, but at the same time, we have to think in, for instance, Penny's presentation gave us an idea about what happened with Latin America, but the question here is, how comparable is the information that he put inside of one view? And that's the main thing. From our point of view, the most important is in relation to get one, best practices. The other thing is how to look the asymmetries. Of course, in the case, for instance, and this is our example, United States, Canada and Mexico, we are working a lot to know which are the most important asymmetries in goods and services. But another key challenge is how to interchange data. The data sharing idea means to reduce asymmetries, to get comparability, to have new views about what happened with the multinational enterprises, how is, if we are talking in the same way. And in the case of the data sources, in the case of Mexico, the multinational enterprises, I just told that we get information from the establishment. But those establishments means if I assume according with the controller or not controller, foreign or not foreign industries, I could create the enterprise. And that means in some cases the view of some multinational enterprises in relation, for instance, with the multinational enterprises that we could look from the United States statistics. So this is the idea to walk around this, to make a better comparability, to introduce new views about fintech or not fintech, who make the comment about currencies or asset. Well, I don't remember, but again, if you see this is the real part of the global value change, of course we have to introduce the whole system to look assets, intangible assets, produced and non-produced assets, financial assets in relation with this new digitalization. What that means in the global view. What that means in the external supply use table, not all is inside of the supply and use table, but becomes part of this new analysis. And we believe that we have to look this information and to put to the users more granularity data. That's the task, that's the comparability is the challenge. The data sharing is another thing to go on this kind of solution, is my point of view. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Please, applause to the panelists.